firstly start by acknowledging the university management through Professor Mkhalong, the Vice Chancellor in absentia, and also the DVCs, DVC of Research, Innovation and Partnership in present, Professor Jessica Singh, and also in absentia, Professor Madaje, DVC Teaching and Learning, and of course the University Registrar in absentia, Professor Masha. I will also want to acknowledge present here the Dean of Faculty of Humanities, Professor Maudu. Of course, this event is held in her faculty of Humanities, and of course in absentia the directors and HODs, our students here, early career researchers and other fellow colleagues in our present. I want to acknowledge you, and of course a special acknowledgement to our distinguished speaker, Professor Loretta Baldassar in present. And of course with her is our colleague by here. We acknowledge you. Our ASSAf colleagues in present, we also acknowledge your presence here. On that note, I'm going to ask that we officially start and allow the DVC Professor Jessica Singh to officially open and welcome everyone in attendance. Thank you. Over to you, Prof Singh.
Thank you very much, Program Director. A very good morning to you all, and a very warm welcome to you on behalf of the university, and especially on behalf of the Vice Chancellor and Principal, Professor Mkhalong, together with the management team. So it is my absolute pleasure and honor to open this public lecture, and also to indicate welcome to you all. And in particular, I'd like to say welcome to our distinguished visiting scholar, Prof. We were trying to pronounce a surname, so I'm going to give it a good try. Professor Loretta Baldassar. She is a visiting scholar, and she is going to be presenting to us a public lecture today. And fortunately, we are privileged that she has been brought to the country as a distinguished visiting scholar in association with a number of partners, and we'd like to acknowledge ASSAf, who have provided the funding for this particular venture, together with accompanying her is the host in South Africa, that is Wits University, and Prof Maria ... Welcome, Prof Maria. She's also our sister university in the country and a partner of the University of Limpopo, that's Wits University. So we would also like to, on behalf of the university, welcome you. And we'd also like to say welcome to all the different people representing different divisions and faculties and departments here today. In particular, the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, Prof Mauto, together with her management team in the faculty. I can see a few heads of departments. And our local hosts at the University of Limpopo, a warm word of welcome to our two Sachi chairs, Professor Sodi and Professor Tamani. They are hosting today's event, and we want to acknowledge and appreciate and welcome them as well. And they have been assisted by our marketing team, so welcome to you all, and thank you for all the effort and hard work put into the event. We are live streaming, so I'm hoping that we have a much bigger online audience as well. So today, Prof Loretta is going to present a lecture to you, and I'm also going to help her to promote the book that she is working on. So she's going to talk about that much more in detail a bit later on. But there is a chapter in the book on work that has been done in this province before. So we're looking forward to a long partnership with you and the type of work you're doing in terms of research together with our university as a whole, and in particular Prof Sodi and his team. So all the best, and thank you everyone, and welcome. We apologize, we did say we need to step out, but we wish you everything of the best for the lecture and also for the rest of the day's events, and we hope you're going to visit again. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Singh. Of course, we live in the age of blending. Thanks to Prof Singh for having reminded us that there are others who may have joined us through live stream. We also acknowledge and thank them for attending online. On that note, we are going to then ask Professor Sodi, Tuleni Sodi, the research chair in mental health and society, to introduce us to why we are here, or the rationale for this particular lecture. Thanks, Prof. Over to you.
Thanks, Program Director, and of course, greetings to everyone, particularly our distinguished visitor. Maybe just to indicate that I am wearing a different hat today, in fact. The reason I'm standing here is because I'm a member of the Academy of Science of South Africa. And so the Academy requested me to put on that hat and then talk about ASSAf and also about the Distinguished Visiting Scholar program. The Academy of Science of South Africa is the official National Academy of Science of South Africa and represents the country in the International Community of Science Academies. The Parliament of South Africa passed the Academy of Science of South Africa Act number 67 of 2001, which came into operation in May 2022. The dual mandate of the Academy is to, firstly, promote and inspire outstanding achievements in all fields of scientific inquiry and to grant recognition for excellence through election to membership of the Academy and through awards. Secondly, to proactively or upon request undertake studies on matters of public interest with a view providing evidence-based scientific advice to government and other stakeholders. So that's basically the mandate of the Academy. ASSAf aspires to be the apex organization for science and scholarship in South Africa, recognized as connected both nationally and internationally. Through its membership, which represents the collective voice of the most active scholars in all fields of scholarly inquiry, ASSAf aims to generate evidence-based solutions to national problems. Now, maybe just a little comment about the visiting scholarship, visiting scholar program, so that colleagues here can get the context. The Academy annually invites one or more distinguished scholars from abroad to present lectures at various higher education institutions around the country. So that's why today we have Professor Baldassar here, because that is in line with that particular mission of ASSAf. The scholars are internationally prominent academics who are inspirational speakers and usually with an ability to bridge the divides between disciplines. The purpose of the Distinguished Visiting Scholar program is to fulfill one of the Academy's strategic goals, namely the promotion of innovation and scholarly activity. Through interaction with distinguished individual scholars from around the world, ASSAf aims to enrich and stimulate research endeavors at South African higher education and research institutions. So that is the brief that I was requested to take care of, and I think I've done that. Over to you.
You have excellently so, Professor Sodi. Thanks, Professor Sodi. And of course, sometimes nature calls while we are in the middle of important events. In that event, just by the corridor, as you go out on your right, you should be able to locate it. I thought that is important to also mention. I am then going to call upon Dr. Lulu Makula, who is the head of Department of Cultural and Sociology and Anthropology Studies, pardon me, to come and introduce our guest speaker, who of course they are from the same field of speciality. So it should be a wonderful one. Thanks, over to you.
Thanks, Chair. And good morning to, firstly, our esteemed guest. We truly appreciate your presence here, and we're hoping to learn a lot from you and to probably even establish, greater relationships going forward. Let me also greet everyone that is here. Thank you so much for making your time to come and, support us as a department, to support the ASSAf, and to also in some light, supporting the professor. My own really is just to introduce the speaker. And, I looked at your bio and I was like, wow. That's all I could say. And you came at a time, I'm sorry, Chair, but you came at a time where I think as an HOD, I was just thinking about ways to, reach out to international scholars. And when Prof Sodi called me and spoke to me about you, I was like, you know what, Prof, count me in. I'm on board. I'm there all the way. So now, and at least I got to hear how to pronounce the surname, because I was about to go all Baldassar on you, but no, but at least that's not the case. So, colleagues and students, before you, we have Loretta Baldassar, who is a professor of anthropology and sociology, Vice Chancellor's Professional Research Fellow, and Director of Social Aging Future Labs at Edith Cowan University. Baldassar was recently named Australian Research Field Leader in Migration Studies and in Ethnic and Cultural Studies. She is lead chief investigator on a medical research future fund, Dementia and Migrant Communities Project, social support stream, lead on National Frailty Kit Project, and co-chief investigator of the Youth Mobilities Project. Her work is widely acknowledged as foundational to the field of transnational family studies, including transnational families in Africa. Okay. I didn't know how to pronounce it, with Machete, or is it Maketi Mesa and Swartz 2023. Her research team is leading innovation in social care across the life course, contributing social science perspective and methodologies to creative and caring professions. Her career has been devoted to better understanding the impact of immigration on families and communities, with I'm going to add a spice, with a special focus on the role of social support networks, intergenerational relations, and the social uses of new technology. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Loretta Baldassar. It's an honor.
Please, another round of applause. I equally went through her, work, and I can say she really deserves another round of applause. we really have a distinguished visiting scholar in our midst. And indeed, we wish and hope we'll learn a lot from what you're going to dish out for us here. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. I feel very honored to be here. I'd like to make a vote of thanks to ASSAf, the Academy of Science of South Africa, and in particular to acknowledge that this year they chose a social scientist to be their distinguished visitor. I think globally, the hard sciences tend to dominate with our focus on STEM, but we all know that STEAM is a better way forward to recognize the role and importance of the arts and humanities and social sciences. So thank you very much. I too would like to acknowledge and thank Marvin Mandiwana, who is the representative of ASSAf, who's been helping to organize. Where is Marvin? Thank you, Marvin. Thank you very much. ASSAf have been really taking care of me, although they are also working me very hard. You're lucky this is the second stop, because I'm still awake and standing. I don't know about at the end. There's so much. It's a wonderful program. To the Deputy Vice Chancellor Research, Professor Singh, for her words of welcome. And may I just also acknowledge her leadership in her role as Deputy Vice Chancellor Research, where I can see, even just from my very short meeting with her, that she values all of the disciplines equally and understands the importance of the humanities and social scientists as well. To Professor Sodi, to Professor Moato, to Professor Magalela, the chair, thank you very much. And finally, to my the people who nominated me for this distinguished visiting scholarship, my colleague, Professor Maria Marchetti Mercer from WITS, and Professor Leslie Swartz from Stellenbosch, who couldn't be here with us today, but will be hosting me when I get to the Cape. So it was really difficult to decide what I should talk about for this lecture. And because I have, as you heard in my lovely introduction, thank you very much for that very generous introduction, lots of projects, including on social aging, on dementia and diversity, on youth mobility. But I decided to focus on a kind of a masterclass on transnational families, because that is where I started. That was my kind of foundation work, and also because part of my time here in South Africa is to launch and promote this new book on transnational families in Africa. It's the first book on transnational families in Africa. So what I've done is I've organized my talk into 4 sections, and I'm going to draw on the case study of 100 years of migration to Australia, in particular Italian migration to Australia, because that's my background and my original research was on Italian migration, to provide a kind of comparative context for the book. We'll look at Australian migration history and transnational families as a bit of a context to understand and compare transnational families in the African context. So I'm going to begin with an introduction to the key questions and themes of transnational family studies. It doesn't matter if you don't know anything about transnational families. I'm starting at the start and bringing you along with me, I hope. Then I'll compare the experience of transnational families in the past in what we call pre-polymedia times, pre-internet. Some of you probably aren't old enough to know much about pre-internet, but you're going to learn a bit today. I'm going to introduce 2 new concepts, and I'm really keen to know what you think of them, digital kinning and digital homing. I'll talk more about them, and conclude by inviting Maria Marchetti Mercer, Professor Marchetti Mercer, to join me to talk a bit about the chapter on Limpopo in the book. So that's where we're headed today. Okay, is it okay if I sit down? Can you still see me? You can still see me, and Also because I'm balancing the microphone and my notes. Yeah. So most of my research, as I said, has focused on so-called transnational families. Can you raise your hand for me if you've ever read about transnational families in the literature, or if you're familiar with this jargon term? Doesn't matter if you haven't, but just if I know. Excellent. Okay, so pretty much nobody. So this is a new idea, new concept for you. So that makes me feel like I'm contributing something already. So by transnational families, I mean families whose members are separated by distance, often crossing national borders, but whose members, despite that distance and living across national borders, they still feel that they are part of a family despite the separation. And on the slide now is the most common definition of transnational families, the most cited definition. So transnational families are families that live some or most of the time separated from each other, but they still hold together and create a feeling of collective welfare and unity, or a sense of familyhood, even across national borders and distance. So now that you know that definition, that jargon definition, can you put your hands up if you are a member of a transnational family? Do you have members in your family who live in other parts of the country across national borders? Just a few of you. Can you put your hand up if you have family who live some distance away, maybe in another province or another city in South Africa? Okay, so transnational family literature is also relevant to your experience. In the literature, we call it translocal families because you're not crossing a national border, but still the distances can be significant. So in my state, I come from Western Australia. Western Australia is about half of the whole continent of Australia in size. So even families who are separated within the state of Western Australia, not crossing a national border, are still experiencing significant distance, yeah, like some of your families are. And I know that from the chapter in the book on Limpopo. Okay, so these are transnational or translocal families, which are really increasingly common experiences. So I want to begin by giving you a little bit of my own history so that you have a sense of who I am and how I got started looking at this topic. Not surprisingly, probably, my interest in transnational families was inspired by my own family history, which spans the century of Italian-Australian migration history. Can I just check? You can hear me okay? Not too loud? Thank you. So my initial inspiration in particular came from the lived experiences of my great-grandmother, who's pictured seated in this slide. Her husband, my great-grandfather, migrated to the southwest of Western Australia in 1925. So next year that will have been 100 years ago. He left her behind in their hometown on the Swiss-Italian border, right up in the Alps. And this was a town, for the geographers, if there are any in the room, that practice transhumance. So the house here in the slide was the summer residence that they went to in the summertime on the top of the village. Summer residence sounds very fancy, doesn't it? But as you can see, it was a very simple dwelling. So my great-grandfather left in 1925. He left her behind. She had 2 small children and she was pregnant with the 3rd. So this photograph was taken a few years later because Annie Mary was born. Annie Mary's the little one with her underpants showing. So she was left behind with these 3 children. And you know, it took 12 years for them to be reunited. That's how long it took for my great-grandfather to raise the money to bring them all over. And that kind of lengthy separation was not uncommon back then. Women like my great-grandmother were known as white widows. White widows because in Italy, widows wear black when their menfolk die. But she was a white widow because her husband was still alive, But really, in a social sense, he was dead. He was socially dead to her. So they were white widows. They didn't have to wear black, but in a way, there was an experience of social death. So I became fascinated with how you maintain a family with that kind of distance and separation. Despite that long 12-year separation, this family managed to stay together. And I've been studying transnational families now for over 30 years, and I've come to understand that distance and absence are managed by the practices and processes of reciprocal care exchange. And these practices of reciprocal care exchange are what I call constitutive of kinship and family life. So I've come to define transnational families by the care practices that connect them. As it turned out, distance and absence were not over for my grandmother even after coming to Australia, because 2 short years after they were reunited, the war broke out and Italy was on the wrong side. And my great-grandfather was interned for the duration of the war, the 5 years of the war, as an enemy alien. And he was taken to South Australia, another state. So they couldn't even visit each other. And this is despite my grandfather being a naturalised British subject, or the equivalent of an Australian citizen, but he was seen as a fifth-column threat. So my great-grandmother was left to run this relatively isolated potato and cattle farm in the middle of nowhere in the bush in the southwest of Western Australia. And the story goes, the story's been handed down, as stories are in families. The story goes that she loved to sing, and singing was the main form of entertainment on the mountain where she lived. Remember, guys, this is pre-television, so people just got together and sang songs. And the story goes that from the day her husband was interned, she never sang again. So I want to reflect on my great-grandmother's story to use it as an example of what we know in the literature in migration studies to be the traditional or historical migration model. So the traditional or the historical migration model is conceived as a one-way movement or a one-way process that ends in settlement. It usually has 3 stages: the departure of the lone male, like my great-grandfather, the establishment of a job and accommodation, which took him 12 years, and then the calling out of the family to settle. And that is a model of migration, a one-way process that influenced social policy. So the social policy that's often associated with the traditional migration model is the policy of assimilation. So the traditional straight line model of migration was more or less relevant in Australia until very recently, until the year 2000, and it directly informed the social policy landscape. It was a migration of settlement because the Australian government wanted migrants, not all, but some migrants, to settle and become citizens. And in this framing of migration, ties to homeland were seen as damaging to that process. So the maintenance of homeland languages, for example, was seen as a threat to assimilation because the government wanted people to come and to become Australian. And I want to dwell on this point about how you define migration to show that it influences the social policy that grows up around it. Because that is a place that social scientists can have a role. We need to be really mindful of the way we frame social issues because it will impact the kinds of social policies that then grow up around them. So the next slide is a little bit scary. It's very, very busy. So take a deep breath. I just want to use it to give you a really quick thumbnail sketch of Australian migration history, just to give you a bit of context about Australia. And I want you to focus on the middle line. You see the different waves. We call them waves of migration. So unlike any other country in the world, Australia can very carefully control who enters the country through social and migration policy because we're an island nation. It's very hard to get to Australia, and you can only get in if they let you in. And this has resulted in what we call a hierarchy of preference, which is evident in the waves of migration shown on this slide. So what you see here is the list of migrant groups and the waves that arrived over time, which clearly show that different migrants came from different sending areas. And up until the 1970s, these waves of migrants were governed by the Immigration Restriction Act. The Immigration Restriction Act was colloquially known as the White Australia Policy, and this act came into being in 1901 at the birth of the Federation of States of Australia. So a really powerful policy born with the Federation of Australian States in 1901 and not disbanded until 1973. That means that this is a powerful policy that we are still feeling the reverberations of today. So you can see that under the White Australia Policy, the earliest waves of arrivals reflected the preference for British, Irish and Northern Europeans in the beginning. And why? Because they were thought to be more easily assimilable into becoming Australians, and they were white. The post-war period in the 1950s and 60s saw a massive influx for the first time of Southern Europeans who at the time were considered non-white. And the then Immigration Minister, Arthur Caldwell, had a really difficult time convincing the Australian people to accept this new non-white wave. And he had a slogan, populate or perish. If we don't populate the country, we're going to perish. And a strong policy of assimilation to convince people that these non-white migrants from Southern Europe would become new Australians. They would shed their homeland cultures and languages and assimilate. And this was such an effective policy narrative that my grandmother, who arrived in Australia at the age of 14, referred to herself as a new Australian until she died at 80 years of age. So this White Australia Policy was dismantled in 1973, and it's only in the 1970s, at the ending of the White Australia Policy, that we began to see the first significant Asian immigration, beginning with the refugees from Vietnam in 73. And a softening of the assimilation policy from assimilation to integration. And that's largely because the children of the post-war, the second generation, people like me, grew up and were bicultural. So assimilation didn't work, it wasn't working. So the government shifted to integration, a slower two-stage step assimilation policy. I must mention that Aboriginal people, Australian Aboriginal people, were not counted in the census in Australia until 1967. Until 1967. And it was not until the 1980s that the progressive politics of multiculturalism, for which Australia is now famous, came into being. And with multicultural policy, we saw an opening up to many, many diverse sending areas. So you see a lot more diversity in the migrant groups who arrive post-1980. And throughout this whole period, migration was characterized as settlement migration. That means that we promoted family reunion migration. We welcomed migrants with their family members, including their parents, because we wanted settlers to stay. And we knew that if you let people bring their parents and their extended family, they were more likely going to settle and stay. All of this policy framing was thrown out in the year 2000. Migration policy moved for the first time to a focus on skilled and temporary migration, with a significant reduction in family reunion, making it especially difficult for extended family, especially parents, to migrate. It now costs $50,000 Australian to bring out a parent, which most people can't afford. And the non-contributory pathway is much more affordable at 10,000 Australian dollars, but it has a 30-year wait period, which is a longer waiting line than most people in the line are going to live. So it's an administrative slowdown tactic, which doesn't really work. So post 9/11, social policy increasingly morphed from multiculturalism into mainstreaming, with a dramatic shift from settler migration to temporary forms of migration. And I can talk more about that if you're interested in question time. I just wanted to give you a bit of background. And here you see the aging of the Australian population and the result of that hierarchy of preference. So this graph shows the blue The blue shaded area are the Southern Europeans, and you can see they're the older groups in the population, and then the green shaded area are Asian from Southeast Asia and South Asia, because they came later. So you can see the impact of the migration policy on the aging of the Australian population. Okay, so we had this dramatic change in migration policy and social policy. So that was driven by changes in migration scholarship. By the 1990s, with the increased connectivity of affordable travel and the polymedia revolution in communication technologies, the traditional one-way migration framework was no longer adequate to explain what was happening in the migration field. At the time, the literature started to talk about a mobility turn or a transnational turn, which I argue in my writing needs also to be understood as a technological turn. So in contrast to the traditional migration model, the transnational migration lens conceptualizes migration not as a one-way movement that ends in settlement, but rather as continuous social fields that cross distance. So rather than leaving your homeland and arriving in the new land and settling, a one-way assimilation process, transnational framings of migration talk about social fields that people inhabit that contain both here and there. So how do we put flesh on the bones of transnational fields? I do it in my transnational family work by looking at reciprocal practices of care exchange across distance. And how do transnational families do that? On the telephone, text messages, Skype calls. All of that activity creates a social field that combines here and there. When you're on the phone, you're here and there together with your family members across distance. So that is the birth of transnational family studies and the transnational turn. And the most commonly cited definition in the literature is this one by Glick, Schiller and colleagues. Transnational migration framework, a social process, not a straight line process, a social process in which migrants establish social fields that cross geographic, cultural and political borders. So those of you who are in translocal families, who have family members in other parts of the country a long way away, we can talk about the way, we might ask you, we might discuss whether you think it's true that you inhabit social fields with those family members who are not here through your uses of social technologies, through your phone calls and text messages and so on. And now, if you have a transnational frame, you also have a different idea about identity. So the traditional migration model, straight line, you had a shedding of your homeland culture to becoming assimilated to the hostland culture. But with a transnational frame, it permits mixed identity because we are here and there at the same time. So we have mixity, we have hybrid and hyphenated identities. The possibility of multiple identities becomes possible. So our framing of social process impacts what we can understand can happen and informs the lived experience and vice versa. So I operationalize the notion of transnational families in my work, as I said, by examining the practices and processes of care exchange between family members across distance. And these practices and processes are facilitated and constituted by the ICTs, by the technologies, the polymedia revolution, as well as by affordable travel. So for me, transnational family or translocal family social fields are comprised of reciprocal care exchange across distance as well as visits. So this is now my favorite quotation from over 200 oral and family migration histories, talking about the impact of new technologies on transnational family life. When I interviewed this grandmother in Ireland about her transnational family life, she had this beautiful quotation which sums up the experience really well. She says, "When my uncle migrated to Australia in the 1900s, we held a kind of wake in the local pub." You know what a wake is in the Irish ritual? A wake is a funeral ritual where you get together at the pub and you have a bit of a party and celebrate the deceased person's life. And even though her uncle was still alive and well, just the fact that he migrated in the 1900s, early 1900s, they held a wake for him because it was like a social death. Again, a bit like what my grandmother experienced. Because, she said, we didn't know if we'd ever see him again. We might not ever see him again. That's what we thought. And then she went on to say that in comparison, when her nephew left for Australia a few years ago on a working holiday visa, his departure inspired the family to purchase a new computer. So from social death to the purchase of a new computer, that kind of sums up for this granny the change in transnational family life, a radical transformation. And this graph kind of shows the changes in the ability to visit, because along with transnational care practices, reciprocal care practices across distance over using technologies, another really important dimension is the visit. And I'm sure that's an experience for you in your translocal family life. Visits are really important, hey, when your family members come back for rituals, for funerals, for weddings, or when you, if ever, go to visit them as well. So this slide shows a snapshot of visits from the 1950s to the 1990s for Italian migrants. And you see in the 50s and 60s, when air travel was really expensive, they were only going, you know, once or twice. And you had to have a really good reason to bury a parent, to go to a funeral, or to get married, like a really important reason to support the expense. But then, in the 80s and 90s, right up to the contemporary moment, except for the COVID years, some people are going every year or every other year. So the visits also capture that transnational social field. It also constitutes the transnational social field. Now, obviously, this is a relatively wealthy community now who can afford this kind of travel, and the ability to visit and the ability to afford new technologies are some of the critical factors in the capacity to live translocal family life, which we talk about in our book, and in particular in the chapter on Limpopo. So just a quick note on methodology. I'm an anthropologist by training, so I do ethnographic, qualitative research. But if you're doing ethnography on migration, you don't really have one village to inhabit. So I talk about my method as ethnographic returning. I return to the networks and communities of migrants that I've been working with over 30 years. And this is a list of the research projects I've done. So it's sort of like a longitudinal study. In addition to that, I've also led some big research projects funded by the Australian Research Council together with Raylene Wilding and Cora Baldock. And we've mostly focused on these particular countries because those countries represent some of the largest migrant groups in Australia and also some of the different types of migrants. So Iran is the site of refugee and humanitarian migrants coming from Afghanistan. Singapore is one of our closest neighbours. And I just noticed that Perth has migrated to Indonesia, and New Zealand has migrated to Papua New Guinea. So there's something wrong with my slide there, sorry about that. But Perth is a great place to study transnational families because it's the most isolated capital city in the world. So more or less everyone who isn't an Indigenous Australian is a member of a transnational family. And I think that's why we got funded, because the people on the funding body were going, oh yeah, I'm trying to look after my parents, you know, back in the homeland. So that's how we got started. This is the theoretical model that we developed to try to understand transnational families. We talk about different types of care, emotional and moral support, which you can give over the phone, practical support, advice, financial support, remittances. That is the mainstay of translocal and transnational family life. You know, why do people migrate? Paradoxically, they migrate to keep their families together. Yeah? And that's something that we say in the book really strongly. Accommodation, personal support. Accommodation and personal support is hands-on care, which can't be done across distance, but can be done by proxy. You know, you might use your networks to facilitate giving care hands-on, by sending another member of the family or a friend. And we see that happening. Then there's different modes of care using different types of polymedia, remittances, gifts, and visits. There's different types of patterns of care: routine, quotidian, ritual, and crisis. And importantly, different types of co-presence. So one of the outcomes of transnational research, transnational family research, has been to introduce a new idea about presence, co-presence across distance, virtual, imagined, ambient, and proxy. So this is kind of controversial concept, because in our understanding of care, most cultures, and certainly the dominant medical model in nursing and medicine, would argue that to care well, you need to be physically proximate. You need to place the hand on the person to help look after them. So we're arguing in transnational family studies something quite controversial. We're saying you can care across distance without the physical. We talk about co-presence across distance. And this is a debate. You can debate with me whether you think this is possible. So we are shifting the deeply held ontological idea about care requiring proximity by arguing that in transnational families, people care across distance. So that is our conceptual contribution to the concept of care, that we can do transnational caregiving, that that if you assume that care requires proximity, you are going to limit your policy and your service delivery by excluding the transnational carers. So that's something to think about if you're doing settlement studies, if you're providing services and welfare. Are you thinking about the distant carer and what they need? And care circulation is another concept about how care circulates in these social fields that are transnational. So this is my last theory slide. Out of this work, we're starting to think about kinning, the concept of kinning. And kinning, obviously from kinship studies, and you know anthropology, the central concept is kinship. But we're interested in the unbiologicized notion of kinship, which the Schneiders introduced in the 1980s in their studies of the Mediterranean. This is the idea that you can have kinship without blood, because kinship generally is defined as blood ties, right? So the Schneiders said, no, sometimes we kin people and they're not blood. You know, they're your fictive kin. The Auntie Mary who's not really your auntie, but she acts like an auntie. She is like an auntie to you. She's not a blood tie, but she's kind of in the kinship network. And this is really important in migrant families, because when you're a migrant, you leave behind all of your real kin and you need to make new kin to support you. And they're often what we call in Italian paesani, townspeople, and they're like kin. So ideas about the family in the unbiologicized notion of kinship are formed on the basis of what is done, what is given, what is performed and exchanged, not on the basis of blood. And this became particularly relevant in adoption studies. And Sinyi Howell developed the notion of kinning through her work on adoption, because an adopted child is not a blood related, usually, sometimes they are. So the process by which a newborn child or previously unconnected person is brought into a kinship relationship is through the action, the activity, the performance of kin work. So with this idea, kinship is something that is necessarily achieved in and through relationships with others. So kinship ties do not exist a priori, but are negotiated on a daily basis through activities like caregiving. And I really like Marshall Sahlins' work on kinship, which is more recent. And he argues, also very controversially, that kinship is an entirely cultural construction, even when it is biological. Kinship is an entirely cultural construction, even when it is biological, because the social bonds of kinship are culturally constructed. And I love his idea of mutuality of being. He says that real kin share a mutuality of being. That doesn't mean, by the way, that you like each other necessarily. You can still have a mutuality of being and really annoy each other, but you are in and of each other's lives. Your identities are wrapped up in each other's lives. And he says that he likes the idea of kinship as entirely a cultural construction, because sometimes we have blood kin who we reject from our kinship networks. We might reject blood ties, maybe because of serious abuse or neglect. So these are ideas that are theoretical to think with. You might not agree with them, but they provide a way to debate and think about the processes and practices that make up our lives. So what I want to do now is give you one little case study to put some examples together for different types of co-presence, this new idea that I'm introducing. Because one of the central questions in transnational and translocal family studies is, can you sustain mutuality of being across distance? Can you care across distance? And how do people do it? So in the pre-war period, I want to just focus on one letter. This is a letter written by Dino, so the second example on the screen, who migrated from Italy to Australia and was separated from his wife and child for 8 years. And at the end of this 8 years, he wrote this letter. He says, "I think of my son Silvio and see him in every moment of the day, just as if I were with you, trying to forget how far away I am. And at the end of the day and after my hard work, I can't have before me everything that made me happy, listening to him, seeing him, playing with him. And instead, for now, I have to content myself with thinking of him and imagine he's in front of me, happy and mischievous, just how he was, and I escape into my thoughts and am happy." So that's an example of imagined co-presence. You can really feel that he still has a mutuality of being with his son, despite 8 years of distance, and the only connection was letters. Do people here remember writing letters? It was a long time ago. Yeah. So that is the pre-war experience. In the post-war, we started to have phone calls. Federica and her family have generally maintained close and regular contact in the 50s and 60s, although there have been what Federica describes as dark periods when she did not feel as emotionally supported as she wished. I felt that, well, I might as well have been dead for them because, you know, I'm so far away. So that idea of social death comes through even in the post-war period. The sense of isolation was exacerbated by contact being primarily by letter and very infrequent phone calls, which gave Federica an unsatisfying level of detail about daily events. She says, "I want to know exactly what's happening. And like during the visit home, I used to find out that this happened, that happened, and I was reproaching my dad for not telling me the negative things, like somebody died." So what happens is people protect their family members and they don't tell them the sad things because they don't want to upset them. But then that really undermines mutuality of being. When you find out, you think, hang on, I'm socially dead to these people. They're not keeping me informed. So these dark periods, Federica said, diminished as phone calls became more affordable. So here we see the amazing transformation that technology provides. She says at first it was so expensive you couldn't really even think about what you were saying because you were worried about how damn expensive it was going to be. But as they got more affordable, you could pick up the phone at any time, and that really made a difference. In this period, a phone call cost $1 a minute, and the average wage was $13 a week. So you really had to think, am I going to spend money on a phone call or am I going to buy the bread and milk? Now, contemporary times, for the Italians at least, Andrea's case is a good representative case. He's studying in Australia and his parents are young old, they're still quite independent, and his mother Anna texts him every day, even too often, says Andrea. She's always sending me these text messages on Viber, these stickers. They're kind of silly, but for her they are a way to tell me that she's thinking of me and that she's caring about me, which we call ambient co-presence. When the ping goes off, when the sticker arrives, Andrea feels the presence of his mother. It's an ambient co-presence, even without reading the message or seeing the sticker. Andrea feels he has to reciprocate by sending stickers back to his mother, but he has trained her to accept that 1 or 2 a day is enough. Andrea says that he has to become religious about the weekend Skype call. You have to have a really good reason to skip the call, like you are dead. So that is comparing the social death that they bemoaned before to too much contact of today. During the call, his mother and father both participate, but it's usually his mother who stays on the call the longest, so this is a gendered experience. Dad will come and take a good look at me, see if I look okay, and say hi. Mum will ask me lots of questions, go into detail. What am I eating? How am I sleeping? What am I feeling? You know, she really worries about me and she tries to look after me. Of course, I like to see them too, but really, once a week is too much. It's an obligation. So he's bemoaning too much co-presence across distance, whereas the earlier waves didn't get enough. So let me compare the pre-polymedia and the post-polymedia as a way of concluding my talk. In the pre-polymedia times, contact and co-presence was irregular through letters, telegrams, and very costly phone calls and rare visits. So as a consequence, mutuality of being was asynchronous, intermittent. Asynchronous means not shared time. The letter came on Monday and you replied a month later, asynchronous. And it was formulaic. You know, people relied on roles, the good mother, the good father. And they were broken narratives. You couldn't sustain, you know, you'd find out that someone died and you didn't know about it for years. So they were broken narratives. Contrast that to today. For some people, the polymedia environment provides the opportunity for daily multiple SMS text, regular emails and phone calls, and affordable regular visits. So we talk about synchronous or real-time continuous co-presence, also ambient co-presence, and multisensory. You can see, you can hear the voice, you can see the person on the video. So these are continuous narratives that approximate physical co-presence. What we also found was that access is uneven. There are policy implications because sometimes it relies on the government to provide good internet access, and the generational divide. Older people struggle with the internet and connectivity. So what we found was surprising. New technologies have expanded support networks compared to the past. Why? Because young people and men get involved because they're the custodians of the technology. They set up the Zoom call for granny. They set up the Zoom call for mum. They scaffold, they text each other, say, cousin, is your mum ready for the call? Because granny's ready at this end. So you see young people involved in the care network in a way that they weren't before. We were surprised to find that. So care across distance increases the intergenerational involvement. So that's a real challenge to the idea that proximate care is the best care and the only form of care. The polymedia environment offers the potential for some people for the first time in history to control when and how they stay in touch. And it gives us choices about how to stay in touch. Do I text mum happy birthday or do I phone her happy birthday? I tell you, in an Italian family, there's only one right answer to that question. And this is the moral choice. Do I text or phone? Or do I visit? The choice introduces a moral element. All communication forms and formats are sources of contestation as well as harmonious relations. I mean, look, care across distance is the same as care in proximate forms. It's hard work. It can be contentious. It can be full of tension, and it can be wonderful. So digital kinning is a way to describe creating mutuality of being using technology. It's a simple idea to help us describe a new experience. And all forms of transnational care, like local care, are made up of a dialectic between capacity, obligation, and negotiated family commitments. And I'm going to end here. So capacity involves access to resources like finances to afford the technology, having the time, having the physical capacity. Can you hear? Do you have the motility to send a text message? Do you have the services provided to allow you to provide care across distance? Obligation are the cultural values and expectations about who should be providing the care. These are gendered, they differ by age, by birth order, by role, by available care services that can support the care that an individual or a family might need to provide. And negotiated family commitments all depend on those histories of family life and who is called upon to care. So thank you very much for your attention. I've left a bit of time, I hope, for Maria to come down and join me so that we can just talk a little bit about how the Limpopo case plays out in this story. Is that okay, Chair? Okay. You've been a wonderful, attentive audience. I thought you might fall asleep.
Thank you. I hope you know you've just had a masterclass in transnationalism and migration. You know, I took about 15 years to understand this work, reading it, and you got it in 35 minutes. So thank you for the opportunity. Loretta and I spoke last night about the lecture and also, I think, about, you know, the context of the presentation, and we thought it really would be useful and hopefully interesting for you to also know how we've applied, you know, some of these principles, which are kind of international to sort of South Africa. So this book is based on a project which the two of us and Professor Leslie Swartz at Stellenbosch University did. It's kind of by the time we started and published the book, it's about 5 years. My fellow colleagues know that, you know, writing a book is a long-term commitment. But what we wanted to look at this whole idea of transnationalism, you know, in the South African context. So we looked at different migrant groups that come into South Africa from Zimbabwe, Malawi. We used Kenya and the DRC. We used those 4 groups. But we also looked at the whole idea of rural to urban migration, you know, and as fate would have it, you know, the one area we looked at, because obviously we also had various academics and postgraduate students as part of the project. We had postgraduate students coming from the Limpopo area, from Modimolle and Guyane, and so we used this actually and when we were coming here, we were quite excited because now, you know, I think we get to speak about this experience. And I'm just going to highlight some of the things, hopefully connecting to what Loretta was saying. So some of the interviews were done with older people living in these villages and looking at their experiences of technology, staying in touch, you know, with their children or their grandchildren who'd gone to work in Gauteng province or study in Gauteng and the use of technology. And then we interviewed some of their family members who were in Gauteng and sort of looked how people kind of manage these relationships of care with technology. And what was interesting, and Loretta has alluded to some of that, you know, technology sounds wonderful on paper, but not everybody has got equal access to it. So the whole idea of the digital divide, as we say, refer to in this discipline, was very evident. It obviously also to use, for example, the inexpensive apps like WhatsApp, you need a very fancy phone. You need a smartphone, which is expensive. You need data, which is expensive. We have load shedding. That, as we know, also impacts connectivity and so forth. So we found really that the older people really struggled with those aspects of technology. Also, the older you get, you know, when I don't have my glasses, I can't read my WhatsApps, you know, and so some of the older people really said that they struggled, you know, as they get older. As Loretta was saying, they were getting the grandchildren to help them, you know, like even I asked my son, you know, I don't know how to do, and they said, Mom, you know, you should know how to do this, you know, so they needed often help to manage this technology, and of course, you know, of the economic issues that people face. You know, if you have to kind of choose, do I buy data or do I buy bread or do I pay towards school fees, people are going to prioritize. And we know data is very expensive in South Africa if you also compare it to other international countries. So there are a lot of challenges that people face in this part of the world. But in all our research, we found that people really mentions this, the fact that you need a lot of expensive equipment. You know, we have all these fancy laptops, not everybody has access, and even the WhatsApp, which is usually the easiest way, the cheapest way, requires a smartphone. So often people then, what do they do? They don't want to, you know, they can't see, they struggle with the technology, so they phone. And phone calls are very expensive. So there's a lot of challenges that people face. And of course, we know families, like we want to know, are our children fine? Are they eating? Are they doing well, in Johannesburg and so forth? They suffer because of this, because, they're not able to stay connected as much as they want. Similarly, with the young people coming into Johannesburg, it's often a very different environment. They also face challenges. For them also, finances are an issue. So they don't always, have money for data. They have to find places where they can get free Wi-Fi. And we know technology is also necessary in order to navigate a new study or work environment. So they also have challenges in that. And one last thing, because I know we're running out of time, visits are very important. We know when we're talking about whether we need to see people, I'm one of those people. I like to see my children, and I like to hug them. I like to go and see my mother. She lives in the Eastern Cape. During COVID, it was hard just calling, I want this face. So visits are an important way that we use to maintain relationships with our family. But visits are expensive. The costs of travel, of public transport, of petrol to drive from Limpopo to Johannesburg. It was, it's not around the corner. So people are not able to visit often as much as they would like to because of this. And the older you get, some of the older people we also interviewed, they found, that the thought of traveling to Gauteng was just too much. Not only the cost, but the discomfort of traveling in a taxi, in public transport, and then getting to Johannesburg, which felt like an unfamiliar environment, was also. So distance also, creates problems for people who are separated. But I think what was very interesting for us, this whole idea of transnationalism, which we tend to see as a kind of across borders, is something that in this very large country of ours, people also experience. You can move 200 kilometers and it can feel just as far as moving from Johannesburg to Perth. That distance is also kind of a socially constructed idea, also depending on your resources and your ability to move and on your ability to use technology. So technology is a wonderful tool, but unfortunately, not everybody has equal access to that technology and the different aspects of technology. So, I think in terms of digital justice, we are a very long way away from equality there. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to gate crash the distinguished lecture. And for me, I'm from Wits. Such a pleasure to be at sort of a neighboring university, which is a bit out of the way, but I've really enjoyed being here. So thank you for welcoming me here. Thank you.
Please, let's give our speaker another round of applause. She has been wonderful to listen to. You have been. And of course, as a mental health practitioner, I can relate with much of the work. But of course, you struck a lot of ideas in me I can always share, but let me not steal the limelight. I'm going to immediately, open for questions. Let's discuss, let's interrogate this lecture. Of course, I have to acknowledge some of the staff members who I saw walking in while the lecture was, going on, and then of course also some students present here. Any questions? Any critical questions? I noted you. Maybe let me take Prof. How would you want to, Prof? How would you want to go? Can we one at a go or?
It depends how much time we have. If we're running out of time, we can collect a few questions. If you
Collect a few questions.
I prefer one at a time.
One at a time. Let's go with your preference. I think looking at the time, we're not really doing that well. Maybe we can about 15 minutes at the most. Then we should be out of here for the next session. I noted one hand there. Okay, we have 3 with Prof. Taman. I'm going to stop it there. Then you go first. Any roving mic? Chap? Any roving mic around? Can somebody help me with roving mics? Thank you, sir. So let me start with you, sir, and then immediately after you follow. And then Professor Temani, perhaps you can also introduce yourself and then your department or specialty for our audience. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Prof, for that eye-opening presentation. It's quite, I don't know. I hope that my questions make sense, because, I have I've been told that some of my questions, they tend not to make sense. My name is Mojalefa. I am in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology under the leadership of Dr. Makola, who introduced you. So my questions is like two questions. So the first question is, it has to do with the kind of like diagram that you showed there when you were showing the periodization of migration and all that. So I couldn't help but to see the link between that organogram and some of the experiences in South Africa. So I just wanted to know that, do you think there's a link between migration and so because what I see there, especially the first part when it talks about assimilation, so there is a direct link between assimilation and separation in as far as South Africa is concerned. So I just wanted to understand if whether you are able to maybe comment on it to say that maybe there is a link between colonialism, for instance, and migration, because the assimilation part speaks to people being assimilated, obviously. And then in the South African part, especially when you talk about the 1950s in your organogram as well, it relates to the separation where people who are not necessarily British, but then they are not accepted as part of their identity. And then the second question has to do with the concept of social death. So I wanted to know if because of social death, can you say that social death kind of like constitutes some sort of like social mourning that then institute some sort of like a coping mechanism that provides people with, I don't know, an idea of social presence or co-presence? Because if someone is socially deaf in as far as maybe being, or rather staying in another country or staying in another province, that as well can also constitute some sort of like social mourning that then leads to the person who's mourning to, I don't know, like have some sort of like a presence that is there. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, because they're big questions. They were very clear. No problem understanding those questions. They're clear, but they're big. So the link between colonialism and migration, wow. Yes. You know what? The White Australia policy, the 1901 Immigration Restriction Act, was based on South Africa apartheid. These were the same ideas, okay? So we borrowed from those ideas. So this is the same colonial encounter, right? But we were an empty continent, terra nullius. The idea that we were an empty continent was encapsulated in the notion of terra nullius, empty land, because people thought that indigenous people were less than human. So it wasn't until 1967 that they were counted in the census. I mean, that is just yesterday, really. So yes, colonialism and migration and assimilation policy are very, very closely aligned. And our country's history is very similar to yours in one sense. It's just that we were empty and we needed to fill it. So populate or perish resulted in this version of apartheid. Maybe we can say that. In terms of social death, I love your question. How do you maintain co-presence with social death? What I think the answer is that people used the communication technologies available to them at the time. Social death happened because there weren't many communication technologies available. There was the letter, and that is limited, but there was ritual. So when were the letters sent? Birthdays, name days, religious feast days. So people used ritual to keep them alive. They used imagination to keep them alive. They told stories. But when we had the polymedia revolution, you could do this by sending a Viber sticker every day, like Andrea's mum. So it's the same practices and processes, but just limited technologies. So I think there's a continuum there. And I think the same theoretical construct can be drawn, just that there wasn't as much capacity. Yeah.
Wonderful. You go, sir, then Prof.
Thank you, Chair.
Please, one question per person. Keep them short.
It's Mr. Modise from the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. I've got actually a comment to actually support or concur with what you're saying with regards to the issue of kinship and migration. Firstly, from my master's, one of my findings, or rather a theme that emerged, it was the one of migration, of which the focus was on the community perceptions around the issue of changing climatic based on basic determinants of health. So the theme that emerged was migration, in a sense that due to the issue of unemployment, young people were forced to migrate into the urban areas as a result to, develop their family, develop, their homesteads. However, the migration itself, it forced, or rather it gave birth to the idea of disconnection and dislocation, where in most cases in deep rural communities you find that the issue of connectivity is compromised. You find that after having a decade of not speaking to your loved ones, family members, they end up relocating again. Then you going back to that initial homestead of yours, you find that they are no longer there. And another one about kinship, it is that migration, or the gap that resulted or gave birth by migration, or dislocation to be precise, it forced, our parents to somehow adopt. Hence, in anthropology, we call it a fictive or a fictitious kinship, where now one adopts a child who have no relation with them, blood related, in a sense of closing, that gap that they've been having about their child or loved one. Thank you.
I really appreciate your comment. I totally agree with you, and thank you for expanding on my ideas and finding them relevant in the context of your work. I could use the term fictive kin, but I choose to use the word kinning because I think fictive kin always has that sort of suggestion that it's not real, it's fiction, even though we understand in anthropology that it isn't. But I also like the way kinning focuses on the agentive, on the practice that you have to make them kin and keep making them kin. And I agree that forced migration because of unemployment created the dislocation and the disconnect. And it wasn't until the polymedia revolution occurred that we could challenge that. So it's no surprise that we talk about transnational families today, and we didn't in the past, even though they existed, because they're much more visible now. We can see how the dislocation and disconnect can be addressed with technologies in ways that were not as visible before.
Thanks, Prof. Temane. Mike over there.
Thank you. That was a powerful presentation. Just, I don't know whether it's a comment, but maybe I need your comment. The dichotomy between the usefulness of technology in bridging the gap where there's a distance, and its social cause of social death. For example, people are living in one household, but they are always on the cell phone, and therefore the wife or the children are then cut off in a way. So what is your comment? Is technology, I see the goodness of it, I see the badness of it. So what would you say in striking a balance there?
I'm so grateful for your question because I believe that it's important not to draw a distinction between online and offline. I think we have to think about how they are co-constitutive. And I also think that technology in and of itself is not good or bad, it's how we use it. And there is a very important literature about the dangers of technologies in increasing dislocation within families, sort of the opposite of what I'm arguing, right? There is a literature about that. But in the transnational family experience, this is what we see. So my work is a bit of a challenge to that work. And I always enjoy speaking to people who know that literature well to see where we can find continuities and discontinuities. Because there's, without a doubt, challenges, you know, in the use of new media, in the way you're saying. At the same time, you know, if I've seen people look at my family, or I've been to dinner with my 2 sons and my husband, and we're all on our devices, and I've seen people go, look at that family, they're at dinner together and they're on their devices. But we are looping in our transnational families in Singapore. My husband was born in Singapore, and my family in Italy, you know, because we want to involve them. So sometimes that's happening. So we have to ask ourselves, what is the technology being used for? And so there is also a literature on, you know, people with disability who are isolated and lonely, but they find their lives come to life online, because online they don't have a disability. They can join a community and be seen as an equal. So this is very textured, and I think what we need is ethnographic or empirical data to help us understand when it's a problem and when it isn't.
Thanks, Prof. I'm going to note perhaps the last 3 hands. I'm looking at time. Keep them short so that we quickly respond to them. Marifa, I noted you first, and then you'll follow Dr. Makola. Over to you. No, there at the top, yeah. Raise your hand, please.
Thank you very much, Prof. Loretta, for such an insightful presentation. I like the way that you shared the history, the way you started off with your great-grandparents and all that. It was very interesting to have that. My name is Marifa. I'm in the research chair, mental health. I'm a migrant from Zimbabwe. Most of my learning has been here in South Africa. So I've got a question based on that particular side that you have. You mentioned 3 concepts: assimilation, integration, multiculturalism. I just want to know what is the current situation now in Australia in terms of those 3 concepts. Have they done away completely with assimilation? Are migrants integrating in Australia? Are they embracing multiculturalism in Australia? Because looking at what happens in the context of South Africa, you would find that in South Africa, the way that is set up, there are specific communities where migrants tend to integrate. They feel at home in those specific communities. So it makes integration easier for those migrants because they can identify with other migrants in that community. Is it the same situation perhaps in Australia, where we have some pockets in Western Australia where we find that this place is known for a home for migrant? And my second question was on the findings that came out under the Limpopo. My question goes to the vets, Prof, discussant. You mentioned a lot of positive issues concerning the impact of technology on transnational families, the issues that it facilitates communication. It brings the issue of proximity. It brings families together. That's what technology is doing. You also identified issues, the challenges that technology presents to these transnational families, where the elderly have got challenges of using the technology, and whereby the young also have challenges which is to do with the data. But I'm interested in your findings. Were there any issues that were raised about technology itself serving or contributing to dysfunctional families? Yes, did that come out from your issue? And I'm also interested if there were any emotional well-being issues that came out from your findings, where these participants affected by the use of technology itself. Because I myself, as a migrant, talking from experience, there are some issues where, yes, technology, I feel close to my family, but there are moments when I receive a phone call, it becomes so challenging.
Thank you,
Were
Marif.
there any health issues? Thank you, sorry for
Both
going
guests will still be here
Thank
with us
you.
for the better part of the day. We can still engage them. Over to you, the first one.
Can I just say that this audience asks really hard questions, and then they ask 2. So yeah, you're really keeping us on our toes. Assimilation, integration, multiculturalism, and mainstreaming. This is another lecture, but can I just say that I've written mainstreaming down here. This is what most social scientists think we currently have in Australia, post 9/11 in particular. So multiculturalism was extremely progressive, and it resulted in plural forms of service provision. So we would have multicultural healthcare providers. We would have ethno-specific aged care providers. You could go to an Italian residential care home, you know, or a Chinese one. That was the heyday of multiculturalism. But with the move to skilled migration, temporary migration, the reduction in family reunion, fortress borders, all of this kind of going backwards, dismantling of multiculturalism, now we have this idea of mainstreaming. In theory, this is that all services are mainstream and all of them can cope with ethnic diversity. That's the idea. In reality, it's back to assimilation, okay? So, but Anthony Moran has written a beautiful book called The Public Life of Australian Multiculturalism. It sounds like the most boring book in the world, but I found it a page-turner because he argues that multiculturalism was so successful that people still retain that value in their homes, in their schools, in their working life. While the policy is mainstream, people still bring forward this multicultural rhetoric. So I have hope that eventually we will return to more formal multicultural policies. But at the moment, we see a retreat to assimilation dressed up as mainstreaming.
I can talk very loudly. My students tell me I'm very loud. That's our own fault. I'm like that, you know, intermediate. So there's this sense that if you don't answer immediately, or if my daughter will say to me, "I see you're online," but but you have not answered my WhatsApp, you know, so I feel like she's stalking me. You know, I usually when she asks me for money, I ignore her. But you know, there's that kind of thing. So it can also impact because I think technology can be very intrusive, and I think we saw that maybe during COVID. I don't know about you, but you know, we used to have like a WhatsApp group in the psychology department. People were sending WhatsApp at 3 o'clock in the morning, 10 o'clock you were sitting at home, and you almost felt like you had to answer immediately. And it kind of, you know, your personal bond and professional boundaries were very much affected.
Right.
And then you said something moving. I thought as a migrant, you get a call and then you put the phone down. And you know, somebody said to me, every time she finishes a Skype call with her father, she feels so sad. She feels like she's had to say goodbye again.
Yeah.
Because now, you know, she knows her father, you know, lives on the other side of the world, and it's like another goodbye every time that call ends. So although it gives us this connection, you know, when you finish, you know, it's done. And on the last note, and this is where Loretta and I agree to disagree, you know, and we're both Italian, so we both like hugging and touching, but obviously I like hugging more. I like this physical presence, but we interviewed somebody, and I thought it was quite moving. It was quite funny, but also moving. So this was a granny, you know, living in South Africa who was leaving Australia, and her daughter and granddaughter was at the airport, and the granddaughter asked her mother, "Is Granny going back into the computer now?" Which also says everything because their connection with a grandmother is very much what she sees on the Skype call on the laptop. And another older woman said to me, it's all good and well, but you can't add computer.
Of course,
So
of course.
that was my aim.
I think I'm going to steal that one and also connect, because it's a bit difficult to be an academic and also master the ceremony. So you want to ask it all, but because you asked a very important question initially. I think it goes to what Prof Maria has just said around, does care really need proximity? Because it goes to that question. Well, then I'm going to then put it in the context of mental health care. COVID-19 suggested that we have to start servicing people virtually. We're still doing it even now. So, we may not answer it now, but we can think more around it to say, does care indeed really require proximity? But again, I can say, from a psychology point of view, maybe we can also look at it, the psychology of it. Does it have to do with personality traits or personality types of people? Some people prefer touch, others, even if at a distance, of course. Sorry. I'm going to allow Dr. Makola, the HOD. Oh Lord, I'm seeing many other hands. Colleagues, we have another session that is due to start 11:30, and we wouldn't want to. Please allow me to allow Dr. Makola to come. Any other questions we can take, and we can always engage on the floor. Over to you.
I'm also loud. And thank you, Prof, for talking about that issue, proximity and care, because that's also something that I really, found very interesting, particularly because mostly maybe some of us are probably taking care of, elderly parents in the homes and afraid to take, opportunities that will lead me to leave the country and end up maybe in Australia, for example, in fear of what's going to happen when I'm away, who's going to, take care of them. Will I, and even if I can find a maid, a nanny, or somebody to take care, I'll still not be, satisfied. So I just wanted, I guess, again, also just to support what he's saying, that it's something that also needs, I would love a deeper, engagement into that transnational care. And yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Prof.
These are just wonderful questions. Do you know that your question is addressed in the second half of my paper, which is about transnational aging, and it kind of answers your question too. So I'm happy to meet Maria halfway and say, physical touch care is the gold star standard. Okay, let's agree on that. It's the gold star standard. But if you use your empirical evidence, you can also see cases where distance has its value. So the young man who said, I never tell my mother I love her, but I spell it out in a text message regularly when I'm away. The young man who says, I never visited my mum, but now that I'm away, I really do miss her, and so I do put more effort into transnational care than when I'm living down the street. I don't do the proximate care as much. So we have to be open to challenging the ontological privileging of proximity in care. Otherwise, we miss things. And I'm saying that because aging in place is the global policy to support people to live independently at home for as long as possible, and I fully support it. But aging in place is through a lens that prioritizes proximate care. So what's missing in these dimensions is the distant carer, and there are many of us. If we miss the distant carer, we miss the policy. What are the policies that support polymedia and digital justice? What are the policies that permit visiting across borders? Which visas allow it and which don't? And if we ontologically privilege proximity, we're going to miss the role of the distant carer, and we need to also pay attention to that because we are increasingly migrants. So that is my point, I guess. And I had more, but I'm so happy to be here and answer these questions.
And thank you for making me aware that translocally we can also suffer social death, because I suffered it. I worked in Durban for about 2 years. Part of the reason why I had to come back home is because I was lonely down there. Thank you. All right, on that note, colleagues, a beautiful audience. You've really been beautiful. I'm sorry, I'm going to close the session and not take any more questions looking at time. And I'm going to then, thanks once again, colleagues, thanks once again. Yes, I'm going to then ask Professor Mahlapan Tamani, the research chair in schools as an enabling environment, to tender us the vote of thanks. Unfortunately, as I've announced earlier, the Dean of Faculty of Humanities has left for a Senate meeting, so this item will be tendered by Prof. Taman.
Thank you very much, Professor Makatlela, for this opportunity to give a vote of thanks. We want to acknowledge your presence here and want to appreciate what you have taught us. And for that reason, we are very indebted to you. And is it Maria? Yes. Prof. Maria from VETS for bringing you here. But at a larger scale, we should thank ASSAf for this idea, noble idea of bringing scholars to go across the world so that they cross-pollinate our ideas. Your topic in particular was thrilling to me, and just reminded me 3 things. I can talk the whole day, you know. Yeah. When my short span in Holland, when I was studying there, I met a fellow, an African fellow, who was cleaning the offices. And I asked him, "Where's your family?" He says, "No, my family is in Ghana." I said, "In Ghana?" He says, "Yes." And when did you last go and see them? He says, 2 years ago. I'm with my father here in Holland, and my mother and the other siblings are in Ghana. And how often do you visit them? He says, every 2 years. And I asked myself a question, is that still a family? Because my concept of family is people who are always together. But your study and your research, I think, is illuminating to understand that there can be a family far away and maybe more caring than a family that's here at home. But your talk also reminded me of the paper I wrote on inclusive education with a PhD student. And in that paper, we're looking at the experiences of children who are left behind children. They remain alone and their parents are either in South Africa or somewhere in the world, in Europe or so on. And the experience, because we did interviews with my PhD student she's a Zimbabwean, so she did some interviews there with the kids, and they were telling some stories. And in those stories, one of them that interested me was these kids were very happy that their parents were far away because they were sending them money. When they are around, they don't get the money that they get to pamper them. So these are very complex social matters, I think, which we need to study. I think I should stop here. There's a phenomenon that is growing in South Africa about, let's say in particular Zimbabweans, because they are in the majority, I think, I don't know, and then people from Mozambique. Then they marry young women here, the Zimbabwean marry young women here, and then we no longer know whether we should chase these Zimbabweans to go back home, because they've done a good thing. They've married our sisters who could not get marriage. So I think this study is worth doing. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm not I'm off and I'm coming back again. Thanks, Prof. Tamani. Just to announce, should have announced before, of course. We have some, finger lunch arranged for the, yourselves in attendance at the staff cafeteria, the VIP section. So from here you can proceed there just to refresh. I see smiles. And then, of course, we will also appreciate it for those who have RSVP'd for the second session with us in the library conference room, first floor, to just grab quickly so that we proceed that side. Prof Sodi will then direct our delegates as to where the library session is. Thanks. You've been a wonderful audience.